Hello, and welcome back to the Aced It podcast. This is season 9, of course, where we turn science into sense. In this season, we provide 10 timely episodes with the hopes of helping listeners understand what we can learn from current research on harm reduction. And let me just say, there is so much here to learn. So, I'm glad you're with us. I'm Danielle Rudes, your host, and this is Aced It. Drug overdoses and deaths have increased substantially over the last 2 decades. In fact, in the last decade, overdose deaths have nearly quadrupled, rising from 21,000 to over 80,000, according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA. One group which finds itself particularly impacted by issues surrounding substance use disorders are individuals who have been involved in the criminal justice system. While capturing the number of people in prison who have active substance use disorders is not straightforward, our best estimate coming from NIDA suggests that over 2/3 of people in prison, over 820,000 of them, struggle with drug use, and another 1/5 were using drugs during the commission of their crime. In other words, if we were to examine a random 100 people who are in prison, 65 of them would qualify as having an active substance use disorder, and another 20 were abusing substances immediately before their most recent arrest. So, only about 15 people out of the 100 are not struggling with substance use. After people are released from prison, they also face much greater odds of overdose than people who have never been incarcerated. In much of the United States, drug use is criminalized, and substance use disorders are often punished rather than treated. Unsurprisingly, punishment is not working to help individuals overcome their substance use disorders. According to Brinkley Rubenstein and colleagues, 2017 study entitled Addressing Access, Risk of Overdose Among Recently Incarcerated People in the U.S., Harm Reduction Interventions in Correctional Settings, the most common cause of death among people who have been in prison is drug-related overdose. The period immediately after release from prison can be especially difficult. If a recently released person remained clean during their period of incarceration, their tolerance level may be lowered. And if a person is unaware of their lowered tolerance, they may consume what was their previously normal amount of drugs, which can in turn prove to be lethal. This post-release period can also prove to be incredibly overwhelming and stressful, as there is a lot of economic and social uncertainty. When you couple a significantly lowered tolerance with incredibly high stress and few resources, a clear and disturbing pattern emerges. This leaves us with the question of whether criminal legal actors, local and state, are currently doing the very best they can do to address this epidemic. The answer is not enough. But one avenue that could be beneficial is providing system-involved individuals with harm reduction opportunities. Brinkley Rubenstein and colleagues provide 4 suggestions in helping the system-involved and substance-using population. First, they recommend developing overdose education and naloxone distribution, called OEND, programs in correctional facilities. This could be especially beneficial for local jails where individuals come right after their arrest and generally leave within a few days. Providing naloxone, or what is commonly referred to as Narcan, and educating people on how to use it could help prevent overdoses among this highly susceptible group. The good news here is that some state Department of Corrections have already started down this road. The New York Department of Corrections, for example, provides people who will soon be released with OEND programming. A second recommendation by Brinkley Rubenstein and colleagues is to provide medically assisted treatment, also referred to as MAT, to system-involved populations. Only a handful of jails and prisons across the U.S. use this harm reduction technique, but it has been proven to be incredibly effective, and so should be the standard of care in correctional facilities. The third recommendation is to develop overdose risk screening techniques that can connect soon-to-be-released individuals with appropriate treatment and wraparound services. Not least, Brinkley Rubenstein and colleagues recommend interagency collaboration. It's no secret that the corrections system in the United States is overburdened and understaffed. Putting an additional risk on the system may not be feasible. This is where community-based partners can be incredibly beneficial. These partners can help in providing MAT during incarceration, or help with wraparound services post-release. This article, which was published over 7 years ago, has what might seem as a relatively straightforward and practical solution to a problem plaguing many correctional facilities and hundreds of thousands of individuals. Yet, given that the patterns of drug use and overdose among the system-involved population have only gotten worse, it is clear that insufficient change has happened. Barriers to harm reduction efforts span multiple areas, and Gorella and colleagues provide an overview of implementation barriers in their 2020 article entitled A Scoping Review of Barriers and Facilitators to Implementation of Medications for Treatment of Opioid Use Disorder Within the Criminal Justice System. The harm reduction barriers include institutional, programmatic, attitudes, and systemic factors. In terms of institutional barriers, many correctional facilities simply do not have the workforce needed to provide services. That is in terms of both size of the workforce, but also in terms of the knowledge needed to provide harm-reducing services. Many physicians who work in criminal legal system environments do not have qualifications to work in addiction medicine. There are also institutional barriers that are policy-based. Some facilities restrict the use of harm reduction efforts, like MAT, to only a small subset of the incarcerated population, like pregnant people. When programs are available, Gorella and colleagues find that they often do not follow medical recommendations for safe withdrawal management and drug use treatment. This is in part influenced by the fact that there is still quite a bit of stigma when it comes to substance use disorders in the criminal legal system and by the zero tolerance policies that the system works under more broadly. Often, people in jail are left to go through withdrawal without proper medical assistance. This can be a traumatizing event, which can leave people unwilling to further interact with any substance use treatment offered during their sentence. It is no surprise that another barrier exists is attitudinal. Many staff and administrators working in correctional settings still prefer abstinence-only based treatment rather than medically assisted treatment due to both ideological biases and lack of understanding of MAT efforts. Another barrier to harm reduction efforts among correctional population is a general lack of connection between institutional treatment and community-based treatment. Using community-based treatment is critical for people who are re-entering society after incarceration. Some such harm reduction efforts exist. Victor, Ray, and Watson published a study in 2024, which focuses specifically on harm reduction strategies used by individuals with a history of incarceration. This study collected information from people who participated in the Syringe Service Telemedicine Access for Medication-Assisted Intervention, or STAMINA for short, with and without a history of incarceration. To be included in the study, a person had to be able to speak English, be at least 18 years old, have an opioid use disorder, and be interested in medically assisted treatment. The study participants were then asked questions about themselves and about whether and how they avoid overdoses, including such strategies as using drugs with another person, ensuring that naloxone was present, testing for fentanyl, and utilizing methadone or buprenorphine not prescribed to them. In other words, the study examined what harm reduction strategies people currently employed. And the authors of this study found some important differences in terms of overdose avoidance tactics. For example, older individuals, white persons, and women study participants were more likely to use various forms of harm reduction strategies. Importantly, the study showed that people with a history of incarceration as a whole were less likely to engage in any harm reduction strategies. This means that system-involved people are at a greater risk of overdosing than non-system involved people. When we look at these three studies together, a bleak picture emerges. Many people who are justice system involved, especially those who are in our jails and prisons, also struggle with substance use disorder. Instead of providing treatment for a medically recognized disease, people who use substances are punished. Placement in correctional facilities that have a zero tolerance policy for drug use put people at risk of undergoing traumatizing withdrawal, followed by little medical treatment or counseling and inadequate linkage to community-based treatment after release. To decrease the barriers to harm-related efforts, we can begin by addressing the suggestions by Brinkley Rubenstein and colleagues educate and provide naloxone treatment to all individuals in prisons and jails, staff, and residents, expand the use of medically assisted treatment in correctional settings, develop a better safety net for people who are at risk of overdosing after leaving correctional settings, and create a linkage between institutional and community-based treatment. We can do this. In fact, we must. Thank you for listening to the ACED podcast. We love hearing from you. So if you have comments, topics to suggest, or some science you'd like us to cover in a future season, please write to me, Danielle Rudes at Sam Houston State University. My email is drudes@shsu.edu. And of course, thank you to the Justice Community Opioid Innovation Network, or JCOIN's Coordination and Translation Center, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, housed at George Mason University, where this podcast originated. Thank you to our fabulous scriptwriters, Dr. Alyssa Toman from Texas State University and Sam Houston State University doctoral student Caitlin Bauer. And a huge and heartfelt thank you to Jason Luchin and the team at Slonky LLC for their spectacular production. Tune in again soon for another episode of ACED.